Our next talk is on machines for getting lost on purpose, Kentucky Route Zero and the future or futures of adventure. Aaron Reed is a writer and game designer focused on helping game makers and players tell stories together. He's a multi-time IndieCade and IGF finalist and has spoken about digital storytelling at venues as diverse as art museums, science fiction conventions, queer game meetups, middle school summer camps, and Google.
Kentucky Route Zero is a game deeply concerned with both the past and future of adventure games. Across its 5 acts, it tells a mysterious, wistful, and entrancing story about hard times, friendships and found families, and living with the past. Finally completed this past January with the release of Act 5, almost a decade after a modest Kickstarter asked for $6,000 for a magic realist adventure game, it's only now that we can take a step back to look at the game as a whole and what it has to say about the genre of adventure games and interactive narrative writ large. Hi, I'm Aaron A. Reed, and this is Machines for Getting Lost on Purpose, Kentucky Route Zero and the Futures of Adventure. A few things to note up front. This talk has been designed to hopefully be interesting regardless of whether you're a diehard KRZ fan or someone who's never played but is curious to learn more. We'll be doing a deep dive into elements of its plot and mechanics, so there will be a few spoilers if you haven't played, but I don't think any that would really negatively affect your experience of trying it yourself. I should also mention that this talk is based on a chapter from a book I recently released with John Murray and Anastasia Salter called Adventure Games Playing the Outsider. This is unfortunately an academic book with pretty high price that's not really in our control, so I can't honestly recommend purchasing it right now unless you're a university library or have access to one. Fortunately, the publishers told us there will be a more affordable paperback version coming out next year, so look for it then. I'll start by talking about the game's overall structure to orient us, and then in the bulk of the talk we'll take a look at what the game has to say about the past, present, and future of adventure games. So let's jump in. As I mentioned, KRZ started with a 2011 Kickstarter for a simple adventure game with a very different art style than the final version, planned at first to be released later that same year. As the developers began to work on it, they realized the story they wanted to tell was spilling out of the boundaries of its original frame. KRZ was ultimately released in 5 acts with interstitial pieces in between, across a period of 7 years. It's primarily the work of 3 creators, Jake Elliott and Thomas Kamensky, who between them did the design, coding, writing, and art, and Ben Babbitt, who did the sound and music. They released the game under the label Cardboard Computer. The story of KRZ unfolds mostly across the course of a single long night, juggling dozens of characters, locations, and ideas, but 2 main through lines emerge. The first is the present-day struggle of a driver named Conway, whom the player most often controls, to make one last delivery for a closing antique store, along with a ragtag band of companions he meets along the road, all similarly struggling with past traumas and uncertain futures. Conway's search for his delivery address leads him underground to the titular highway, the Kentucky Route Zero, and the subterranean Echo River, which both meander through a dreamlike underworld Appalachia whose residents face the same struggles as folks on the surface. The second story, seen mostly through distancing reminiscences, recreations, or retellings, centers around the artist Lula Chamberlain, part of a fictional band of computer pioneers who retreat to an underground cavern in the 1970s to complete a revolutionary computer simulation system called Xanadu. The project failed, leaving its survivors in eternal limbo, always wondering how things might have been had they succeeded. As with everything in the game, these threads are closely twined together, sometimes in space and time bending ways. The address of Conway's delivery, for instance, is the apartment where Lula was living decades earlier when the dream of Xanadu was born, suggesting the game's journey is a quest, possibly fruitless, to return to a long-vanished place of inspiration. Given the strong parallels KRZ makes between Xanadu and the classic game Adventure, and we'll dive more into that soon, it's not unreasonable to see one layer of the game as a study in how, whether, and why one might try to recapture the magic of the adventure games of old. So let's start there, with the ways, both obvious and subtle, that KRZ connects to the adventure genre's rich history and distinct traditions. The game's visual design is an obvious place to jump in. Its stylized characters evoke, while not directly copying in the sense of 8-bit aesthetics, the limited graphical capabilities of early home computer systems. And the way it frames its scenes in mostly long establishing shots mirrors the technical limitations that led pre-3D adventure games to divide space up this way as well. But KRZ turns this artistic limitation into a deliberate device, connecting this kind of perspective view to theatrical traditions of stage sets and scenery. With an elegant choreographed artistry, The game's sets function like backdrops in an enormous theater, gliding smoothly on and off stage, the camera tightly controlled to shift the framing of each scene's beats as a single unbroken moment. The designers have spoken of being inspired by theatrical traditions around space, blocking, and set design, in contrast to techniques from cinema that most modern games emulate, like the cut, the close-up, or the tracking shot. The game also moves at a slower and more contemplative pace than most modern games. Its designers mention taking inspiration from filmmakers like Tarkovsky and Kurosawa, who are, quote, bold in their use of slowness and stillness. But this also echoes the pace of classic adventure games. One of the things I notice most when I go back and play these games now is how slow it feels to have to wait for your character to walk across the screen. In some games, like Loom, the view would sometimes pull back even further to reveal the immensity of a space, and your character lost within it. That kind of slowness has been designed out of most modern games, but it's present, even drawn attention to, in KRZ. Conway injures his leg early in the game and moves with a limp through its cavernous underground spaces, often leaving you no choice but to wait for him to arrive where he's going and think about what you're looking at. Another way KRZ connects to its adventure game ancestors is through its use of multiple channels of storytelling. Infocom's text adventures famously came with feelies, from flyers to comic books to in-world props, in an effort to make their worlds feel more expansive than what a single disc could contain. Loom came with a cassette tape containing a 30-minute audio prequel, and a physical notebook to record magic spells in. Games from this era often had hint lines you could call, navigating phone trees to get the right nudge to unblock your progress. KRZ likewise yearns to reach beyond its boundaries, and the interstitial releases between acts often included weird experiments and real-life components. Limits and Demonstrations is a playable museum exhibit of Lula Chamberlain's work, which was also staged in partial form at a real-life gallery in Philadelphia. Here and There Along the Echo was originally released as a phone number you could dial to navigate a surreal phone tree. One extension invites you to share a memory after the beep. In the game's next act, released many months later, a character can check his answering machine messages to listen to a seemingly endless stream of these recordings. The creators also sold real phones on eBay and in live streaming auctions modified to only be able to call the Echo River number. The Entertainment is a full one-act play, which could be bought as a printed book, experienced in virtual reality as an on-stage but silent cast member, or reenacted with friends via a series of detailed instructions. And Un Pueblo de Nada takes place behind the scenes of a public access television station during a live broadcast, which was also actually filmed with human actors and released online. Until its final compilation release this January that brought some of these pieces together in a single download, the experience of playing KRZ, like those early games, spilled out of its notional boundaries as a single piece of software bound within a box, a screen, or a fixed duration of play. Those of us who were fans all along lived with KRZ's unfinished state for years, much like kids playing adventure games who would sometimes have to wait months before the solution to a puzzle would unlock the next bit of story. The game's primary interaction mechanic, other than movement, is the dialogue tree, a convention popularized by LucasArts adventure games like Monkey Island. While in classic games this mechanic was generally used simply to pick what to say in conversation, KRZ uses the mechanic in a much broader way, to establish how your character feels about what's happening, to help define parts of the story world, to interact with devices, to direct pacing and flow. We'll delve more later into the game's take on the meaning of choice and agency in an interactive story, but the dialogue trees are another part of classic adventure game design vocabulary that KRZ reworks and repurposes to serve its own more modern ends. So KRZ is built on these general adventure game tropes, but is also rich with references to specific adventure games, particularly the earliest. The strongest thread is its connection to Will Crowther and Don Wood's original Adventure, which history remembers with some typical fuzziness as the first adventure game. Lane Nooney has done some great work recently challenging this narrative, by the way, that's well worth checking out. But it's absolutely true that Crowther and Wood's Adventure had a big impact on the generation that would build the first adventure games. In the early 80s, these games were often called just Adventures, plural, and multiple companies were named after it. And KRZ has references aplenty to Crowther and Wood's first game. To name just some, Adventure was inspired by the real-world Mammoth Cave, based in Kentucky, hence the game's name, and Act 4's Mechanical Mammoth. In its first scene, you're given a lamp as you head underground, just like in Adventure. The game's geography makes frequent references to locations in Adventure, like the Hall of the Mountain King or its twisty little passages, or people connected to the real Mammoth Cave, like Stephen Bishop, a slave who hoped to earn his freedom by exploring and mapping it for his master, and whose maps were still in use generations later. The game even has a character named Donald and a character named Will, if you still hadn't figured it out. In fact, the game's creators in the past used to wear this inspiration even more on their sleeve. Before they were Cardboard Computer, they went by the moniker the Guardians of the Tradition, under which name they created an exhibition piece housed in an Infocom-style box that remixed text from Adventure with biographical stories about Will Crowther. And while it's a graphical game, KRZ also includes long sequences that play out entirely in text, sometimes fading the visuals away entirely, connecting it to the text-based games that dominated the first decade of the genre's existence, and have continued to be a rich source of designers and ideas ever since. So it's clear that the game's creators want us to see KRZ as connecting to the deep history of adventure games. There's an almost palimpsesting that happens here. The real Mammoth Cave and its many stories and legends, the game made about it that spawned the industry of digital storytelling, and this new game where going underground is both a physical act and a powerful metaphor, and where the context of what's on the surface still matters. There are also references to other parts of early computer history. The first character you meet in the game is a blind gas station owner named Joseph Wheattree, who vaguely alludes to having once written poetry on the computer. On his office desktop, you can encounter a thinly veiled clone of 1960s chatbot Eliza, which was one of the first programs to bring the idea of computers understanding and responding to language into the public consciousness. Eliza was created by a man named Joseph Weizenbaum, whose last name is German for Wheattree. The game's Joseph Wheattree is blind, and it's possible this is a reference to Weizenbaum's later disavowal of Eliza, claiming that people's desires to project intelligence and empathy onto his simple program did more harm than good, despite it firing the imagination of generations of creators. Magnus Hildebrandt has a great series of posts called Kentucky Fried Zero, which unfortunately I believe are no longer online, that cataloged dozens of other possible references in the game's character names. Lula Chamberlain shares a last name with William Chamberlain, who in 1984 published the book The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, attributing authorship to his program Ractor and calling it the first book written by a computer. Conway's first companion, Shannon Marquez, may reference the author of 100 Years of Solitude, one of the most famous works of magical realism, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Conway himself shares a last name with the creator of Conway's Game of Life, the first digital cellular automaton. There's a theme across all these references about the edges between reality and magic, or between software and sentience, an homage to the most magical moments computers have brought us in the past half-century, moments of collaboration between people and code. And adventure games are certainly part of that tradition of wonder. One of the spots where these references are most richly layered is in Act 3, the only one to focus mainly on the Lula Chamberlain and Xanadu side of the story. In a vast chamber called, after adventure, the Hall of the Mountain King, you find the abandoned Xanadu computer, visually styled after the groundbreaking PDP-1 mainframe that debuted in 1960, and on which was created the first interactive word processor, the first computer chess, the first major time-sharing system, and some of the first examples of computer music. On the Xanadu computer, you can start playing a game that mingles the exact opening text of Adventure with line graphics reminiscent of Roberta Williams' Mystery House, one of the first graphical adventure games. The Xanadu game quickly turns into a playable version of its own origin story, as if it can only tell you its history in the language of the transporting games it was designed to enable. Soon you find yourself playing a resource management game reminiscent of Hammurabi, another of the earliest text-based computer games, to convey the way Xanadu's creators had to fight against time and the elements in the hopes of completing their masterpiece. The leader of the doomed Xanadu project was a man named Donald, and interestingly there have been several influential Donalds in computer history associated with grandiose projects and doomed ambitions. There's Don Woods, of course, who extended Will Crowther's Adventure and brought it to the masses. There's software architect Donald Knuth, whose 50-year mission to define the art of computer programming remains unfinished. There's AI pioneer Donald Michie, who created one of the first self-learning computer programs. But I think there's an even more obvious analog for the game's Donald, and that's early computer visionary Ted Nelson, whose real-world 1970s Xanadu hypertext project envisioned a radically new, never fully realized way of interacting with interconnected text. Nelson was one of the earliest advocates for the transformative power of computers. A decade before most Americans would start getting the chance to interact with one, his Computer Lib Dream Machines manifesto foresaw the enormous revolution that access to computers would bring about, and the urgent need to find new systems of organization and thinking that would thrive in that interconnected world, rather than letting stale old models pollute this digital Eden. But as big businesses shouldered their way in and created a home computer industry, Nelson's radical ideas were smoothed out and paved over. In the game, Donald sits around a perpetually burning bonfire of old computers and says, "Do you have any idea what it's like to spend your life building something and then sit powerlessly as your work declines into ruin?" In Act 3, you learn how Donald, Lula, and a handful of other visionaries had to go literally underground with their research into more and more elaborate computer simulations. There's a great description of them slipping into the mouth of a cave with bulky computers rather than expedition gear strapped to their backs. There they devoted their lives to building this perfect system that would realize all their dreams. Donald wistfully rhapsodizes of Xanadu. There was so much more to it. Ornate labyrinths of memory, exhaustively simulated parallel cave ecosystems, real artificial intelligence built on sophisticated neural network algorithms. The birds in the forest could flock in 3 dimensions. The bats could learn to sing. He tells you the secret of Xanadu's potential. The digital circuitry had fused together with cave mold, making it unpredictable, chaotic, perhaps even once alive. Donald says, "You've seen it for yourself, what's left of it, the chalky bones of a beautiful dream. But you can see what it once was, can't you? Can't you?" I see in Xanadu shades of Ted Nelson and the early hacker dreams of truly open systems that could change the world. And I see a parallel story there to the history of adventure games, which also made big promises and drew players to their beautiful dreams of nearly limitless potential. Many of us fans can rightly be accused of being almost as starry-eyed as Donald. But it's relevant to this interpretation that KRZ's Xanadu didn't fail on principle, it was sabotaged. You learn the computer was continually tampered with by the Strangers, who appear in the game as skeletons of crackling electricity, representatives of the soulless power company that's been slowly taking over the game's Kentucky, both above and below ground. Countless once local and independent outfits have been shut down, bought out, or crippled by Consolidated Power. One of these is Hard Times Whiskey, whose product Consolidated has turned into a tool of addiction and control. And this turns out to be the source of the Strangers' interest in Xanadu. This is kind of convoluted, but stick with me. When whiskey ages, and this is a real thing, some of it evaporates, what's called the Angel's Share. We learn in the game that Consolidated Power's owners decided Xanadu's organic mold was feeding off that whiskey in the air, which they considered their whiskey, that the Xanadu project was stealing from them, even if that theft cost them nothing. They sent the Strangers to sabotage Xanadu, crippling it both to defend an abstract principle, but also to keep everyone else under their thumb, and all the control flowing back up to them. Maybe I'm reaching, but we might read Consolidated Power as the business forces that took over gaming from its outsider creators, turning their radical experimentation and dreams of a revolution caused by the unpredictable collaboration of man and machine into a system of controlled, reproducible successes, inventing addictive game mechanics to keep players hooked, smoothing away the rough corners of experiences like moving too slowly, typing whatever you wanted at a prompt, or sharing software with your friends. But there are no easy villains in KRZ. At one point, you find a degausser that momentarily makes the skeletons less faded, giving each one a few moments to tell you their life story and their name. It turns out they're all just regular folks who got in too deep with the power company and were offered a job to pay off their debt. None of them want to be what they've become. They're just doing their best to get by in a world that would crush them if they didn't. So now we've arrived at the present, what KRZ has to say about today. As with the Xanadu story, I think a lot of the game works on multiple levels, commenting on both society at large while also being in dialogue with its genre and its past. But I want to start with one of the game's most obvious layers. It's a story about many things, but one of them certainly is debt and poverty. Kentucky, of course, is Rust Belt country. It's a region that hasn't seemed to have caught much of a break in a long time. In Act 1, you explore an old mine tunnel and hear a story inspired by many true ones of miners paid only in company scrip, only able to buy things from the company store, never able to save enough to leave, and in fact only growing more and more indebted to their employers. A point the game makes again and again is that these abhorrent practices are not things of the past. Predatory loans, union busting, the weakening of worker protections, recessions, wealth inequality, and many other ugly parts of capitalism continue to grind people down and force them to struggle to retain their humanity in the face of the inhuman systems which Consolidated Power represents. Across the game, you meet dozens of characters, and almost all of them are struggling to survive in the face of foreclosures, recessions, floods, hard luck. Conway, a recovering alcoholic on his last delivery for a closing shop and helplessly slipping into debt, ends up traveling with a kid whose parents abandoned him at a bus station, a repairwoman who only fixes analog TVs and is $200 away from eviction, and 2 musicians who aren't sure where their next meal is coming from. Co-creator Jake Elliott says, "It's not a game about people who are in power. It's definitely a game about people who have been disempowered by circumstances." Laura Hudson had a lovely take on an article for Slate where she says, "Although your motley crew has the look of adventurers, when you listen to their stories, you realize there's another word for what they are. Homeless." Adventure games have a long history of telling stories about outsiders and underdogs, although originally with a less serious bent. Many of the genre's earliest protagonists were lovable losers. Characters like Space Janitor Roger Wilco, or Leisure Suit Larry, or Laverne in Day of the Tentacle, or Guybrush Threepwood. Maybe this was a result of the contrast that more intellectual, puzzly games made with the power fantasies and more action-focused games, and heroes like Lara Croft, Solid Snake, or Master Chief. Or maybe it said something about the kinds of people making and playing those games, and I say that with the maximum amount of love possible. But as modern adventure games have struggled to recapture whatever it was that made the genre memorable in the first place, they've often turned to more serious stories about outsider characters and misfit heroes. Characters like Henry in Firewatch, a man struggling with the shame of running away from his dying wife, or Chloe in Life is Strange, or Maeve from Night in the Woods, or Conway. As always, the slower, more contemplative pace of adventure games provides a stage for telling different kinds of stories than mainstream games, and centering other kinds of characters. And I think the ensemble cast of Kentucky Route Zero fits right into this pattern. Overlooked people and marginalized identities fill up the game's extended cast, where you can meet characters who are queer, brown, blind, orphaned, old, jobless, broke, neuroatypical, each with their own stories to tell. To pick just one out of many examples of non-traditional characters, at a floating gas station along the Echo River, you can find an elderly divorcee waiting to meet a woman he met through his first ever online personals ad. He's never met anyone through the computer before, and is terrified it's not going to work, and he's going to spend the rest of his life alone. He asks you for feedback on his online personals ad, which reads in its entirety, "I'm a good-natured man, retired, and spend most of my time sailing the Echo River, riding currents of subterranean gas and that strange invisible wind that moans out of the small tunnels along the bank. Seeking a companion to map the river with me. I have 2 grown children, but they live far away. No goofballs." This is not the kind of character who gets to tell their story often in a typical video game. KRZ's characters are haunted by ghosts, sometimes literal, but often figurative, and they're filled with powerful yearnings for something they once had, that since slipped away. Deep underground, you can meet the last telephone operator at an almost forgotten switchboard, training the machines that will finally replace her. "Think of me when you dial 0, she says. At the failing community access television station, the producer muses, "We're hanging on long past our expiration date," just before a catastrophic flood that sweeps her and her studio away. Bats in the cave are dying and no one knows how to help them, something that's also happening in real life. In Act 1's Mine, Conway stumbles across an archive of reel-to-reel tapes, forgotten working songs of long-dead miners. Since the old wires in the mine can only power one system at a time, he can only listen to the tapes in the dark. And in one of the game's most powerfully human moments, itinerant musicians Junebug and Johnny sing a song to a near-empty dive bar called "It's Too Late to Love You Now." I think KRZ's creators are drawing a parallel to the twin lost sparks of the American dream and the potential of early computing. The magic of those early games is fondly remembered by many, but has often seemed extinguished, unable to be recaptured, too late to love. Some of the stories you hear in KRZ are sad, but some find hope in the resilience of the human spirit, and that connects to another of the game's dominant metaphors, its obsession with the technology dominant when adventure games were born. The game is filled with 1970s computers, real machines, and tape recorders, videocassette archives, CRTs, chattering printers. These were the world the earliest adventure games were written in, a period straddling the uneasy transition from analog to digital, and, crucially, from tech that can easily be understood, hacked, repurposed, and subverted to sealed devices and closed platforms that cannot. Our increasingly consolidated real-world tech makers are often hostile to outsider creators, preventing unlicensed software from being installed on their devices or content from being distributed except at their company stores. They want their angel's share. Apple no longer makes anything like the HyperCard platform that enabled so many outsiders to create their own computer games, including Myst, still probably the best-selling adventure game of all time. Music purchased from Google Play in 2019 could not even be downloaded, let alone remixed, copied, or sampled. By the end of 2020, as you may have heard, you won't even be able to play it at all. Music is another running thread in KRZ, especially folk music and experimental sound art, the kind of music created for love, not profit. In Act 4, playing as orphaned kid Ezra, you travel the river for a while with a performance artist named Clara, who gives you an old tape recorder and asks you to find interesting sounds. Later, while a riverboat audience gathers to hear her play the theremin, another quintessential straddling of the analog-digital divide, she asks you to accompany her by choosing tapes to play and how and whether to modify them by tweaking the volume, speed, or direction. I found this sequence surprisingly moving. There's something in this old tech, the game seems to say at every turn, and our ability to own, modify, share, and remix it, that's worth keeping around, that shouldn't live only in the past. The theme of reclamation and reinvention is another strong thread throughout KRZ that counters the gloom. Conway and Lula's journeys both lead them to the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, tracking things displaced and places renamed, housed itself in a former cathedral. And across all 5 of the game's acts, you'll find ad hoc communities pulling together despite long odds. While its characters are sometimes sad and often struggling, they're also surprisingly hopeful, resilient, and fearless in their quests to thrive outside the mainstream, remaking themselves in answer to the normative systems that cast them out. Many of the characters you meet have forged new identities out of the broken pieces they've been given, making art from noise, homes from ruins, feasts from whatever's dredged up from an underground river. Wandering musicians Junebug and Johnny, it turns out, are mechanical people, built by a mining company for menial labor. They too found the old recordings of dead miners' songs, and in them a spark of humanity that led them to escape and rebuild themselves in a self-made image. Driving the game's back roads, you can find many beautiful optional vignettes, easily missed by those rushing through, but profoundly important in aggregate to the game's overall meaning. One of my favorites is when Conway finds an abandoned office building, the home of a rural electric cooperative swallowed up by Consolidated Power. The building seems ominous, a red glow coming from somewhere inside, but if you brave its dark hallways, what you find is not death, but a strange new beginning. The handle is loose and the door swings open easily. The hallway fills with warmth, light, and the smells of smoke and coffee. About a dozen men and women sit around a campfire in the middle of a large room. Cubicle walls have been cut into pieces, some leaning up against the walls, and some are arranged into stacks of firewood. One of the women waves to Conway and offers him an empty chair. It's missing wheels, but it's comfortable and easily adjustable to his height. Someone takes a pot hung above the fire and pours coffee into a styrofoam cup. Conway accepts it, and they all return to watching the fire. And that brings us to the futures of adventure. And this theme of reclamation dovetails nicely with another, maybe less obvious thread I see in KRZ about challenging norms and remaking old structures. Bo Ruberg's latest book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer, talks about deep-seated resonances between queerness and games. And by that, Ruberg means both queer games in the literal sense of representation, games by or about queer people, but also in the more conceptual sense that comes from the field of queer studies. Ruberg talks about how we can read queerness as a way of being, doing, and desiring differently, a term for a way of reimagining, resisting, and remaking the world. Across the book, they consider how modern indie games are challenging the normative logics. I lost my place. The normative logics that traditionally have dictated how games are played and how they communicate meaning. So KRZ isn't a queer game in the representational sense, but this notion of challenging norms, experimentation, and inventing new futures resonates with me as a lens for interpreting it. It's a game writhing with challenges to the status quo, both in terms of the plot and characters we've been looking at, but also in its mechanics and design. It's filled with ideas about different ways stories might be fluid. Almost every scene has some new twist on your mode of interaction, which is part of why the game's become so beloved among interactive narrative designers in particular. Just to name a few of these moments, you can visit a diner with a procedurally generated menu. You can play a scene where you're controlling multiple conversations simultaneously with parallel dialogue trees. You can get narrators reminiscing about the events you're seeing from the future or framing your choices as hypotheticals, not actual events. There are games within games, from a menu-driven interface to an arcade claw machine, to navigation minigames, to some of the playable recreations of early text games we mentioned earlier. And even games within games within games, as in the several instances where characters in an internal vignette find themselves in turn playing yet another nested interactive story. In Limits and Demonstrations, you can interact with the Lula Chamberlain piece that's an homage to real-world video artist Nam June Paik, who, among other things, is credited with inventing the superhighway analogy for the internet. A maze of magnetic tape strips hangs in the gallery, and you manually move a tape head over them to hear a story, which turns out to be interactive, with choice points represented as instructions to physically move the tape head a certain number of feet and inches in particular directions, based on where you want the story to go. This thread of experimentation carries through parts of the game outside its dialogue system, too. In one scene, as you move Conway through a space with Ezra following, you eventually start to realize that you're no longer controlling Conway, but Ezra. The exact moment your control switched is slippery. By the time you notice it, you've already missed it. KRZ is constantly challenging our assumptions about what kinds of things dialogue options are supposed to control, about what our relationship to an on-screen avatar is meant to be. It rewards exploration and rejecting what's flagged as the straight path through or the right choices to make. Like many classic adventure games, it contains dozens of unusual responses and optional scenes, often nestled in far corners of the map that can be larger than they first appear. Ruberg has also talked about the idea of permalife for games which not only include but center the notion of making death impossible. They discuss this originally in the context of walking simulators, like Virginia, and note that permalife games are often made by queer designers, positing that, quote, permanent living represents a particularly potent trope for expressing both hopes and concerns about contemporary queer life in the face of an uncertain future. But Ruberg resists the reading of this mechanic as purely utopian. In contrast to the dominant narrative of LGBTQ lives and histories getting better, permalife suggests alternative models for queer ways of living that persist in time, loops, endless flat lines, a constant entanglement with death, which in these games is always intimately entwined with life. It also challenges us to look for the consequences of living in video games as well as the consequences of dying, to think about existing and not just surviving as difficult, and to identify places where life, and not death, is what gives video games meaning. You can't die in the traditional sense in KRZ, although you often lose control of the character you're playing, sometimes permanently. Instead, the characters you play mostly have to go on living, no matter what choices they make, and as hard as that might be. And to me, this suggests one possible future for adventure games. Games like walking simulators have often been challenged for not offering the chance to divide players into hierarchical groups, to demonstrate the mastery so closely associated with traditional gaming. You can't really get better at a walking simulator than someone else. There's no way to divide elite from noob. Unless you think I'm just talking about action games, adventure games do this too, branding players as either the clever ones who solve the puzzles or the dunces who could not. Permalife games, queer games in the broad sense we've been talking about, are one approach to breaking down these kinds of binaries. What does it mean to design games around other conceits than these? And how can we tell interactive stories about more complex concepts than choosing the left or right path? One approach, which KRZ often uses, is to make the player's choices less about controlling the narrative than about engaging with it on a more emotional level. While some of your choices are in fact quite impactful, you can see two almost completely different Act 4s depending on which characters you choose to follow. More often, the game's asking you to participate in a different kind of way. Reviewer Ansh Patel said this about the game's choices. Ranging from despondent, bitter, to hopeful, each choice holds a mirror to the player, asking them a basic question that games rarely if ever bother asking. How do you feel? In one Act 4 scene, Conway's crew visits a Greasy Spoon diner with a table covered in shellac, perfectly preserving a long-ago half-finished meal. The husband and wife owners of the diner each have a different story about why the table is preserved, what it means to each of them. The game doesn't care which of them is right, if one of them has a faulty memory or if both of them do. It asks you to think about what the stories mean to the people who tell them, and what they mean to you. We've mentioned puzzles a few times, and I also want to talk about what KRZ has to say about them. It's not quite true to say the game has none. In the opening scene, for instance, the way to find something that glows in the dark is to turn off your light. But these moments are gentle and rare. The designers have talked about wanting to design mysteries, not puzzles, a distinction borrowed from an unlikely source. During the era of George W. Bush, political analyst Gregory Treverton wrote about the changing landscape of world powers in the 21st century, where once straightforward-seeming problems were becoming anything but. Osama bin Laden's whereabouts, he said, are a puzzle. We can't find him because we don't have enough information. The problem of what would happen in Iraq after the toppling of Saddam Hussein was, by contrast, a mystery. It wasn't a question that had a simple, factual answer. Mysteries require judgments in the assessment of uncertainty, and the hard part is not that we have too little information, but that we have too much. So you can solve a puzzle if you can find all the clues, but a mystery, to quote KRZ's Jake Elliott again, cannot be answered, it can only be framed. Puzzles are clearly more satisfying, but the world increasingly offers us only mysteries. The designers of KRZ found this an appropriate metaphor for their story, drawing inspiration from the struggles of real people with no easy solutions to their problems. This approach is thematically appropriate for KRZ, but also suggests a new way forward for narrative games more generally, inviting the player to engage their own creativity and meaning-making rather than imposing a single correct outcome. Puzzles take much of their joy from a moment of inspiration where you suddenly see the correct solution, and that joy in turn is a key part of the pleasure of classic adventure games. But other kinds of revelations can be just as powerful. Porpentine and Brenda Naotome's game With Those We Love Alive asks you, the player, to draw symbols on yourself at key moments of the story, as a ritual to help the game's protagonist achieve increasingly emotional goals. The experience is intense because the game makes you relate its fiction to your own personal vocabulary of meaning and experience, and asks you to decide how much to open up and let it in. Another interesting example of Sam Barlow's Her Story, where you're exploring a maze of video clips via the words used in each one. Exploring this massively interconnected archive is so idiosyncratic that two players might have very different journeys and moments of revelation, because the focus is less on fixed challenge points than on discovering the sparks in your own understanding that connect one plot thread to another. There's another kind of mystery that has a pretty bad rap among game designers: the maze. There's a great talk from KRZ's creators called How to Get Lost in a Cave, where they call a maze a machine for getting lost on purpose, and you can tell I love this because it's the title of this talk. Mazes were a much hated part of classic games, but in this talk, Jake Elliott speaks of their potential pleasures. Pardon me. A maze as a place where we can just focus on the feeling of lostness, the reason we're there in the first place. This sense of disorientation, frustration, and uncertainty of being lost in a maze, like the frustrations of being stuck on a puzzle, have often been designed out of modern games, rejected for not being fun, juicy, or addictively rewarding. But I think Elliott and Kamency are right when they say there's something of value that's lost when we streamline those moments of frustration and uncertainty out of our design vocabulary entirely. Having spaces to get lost in is important. Having games that ask us to work to engage with them is necessary. So here I identify another future for adventure games, continuing to be weird, challenging, disorienting spaces, sites where players can explore material and mechanics outside their comfort zones. In their talk, KRZ's creators offer instructions for how to get lost in a cave that might also be useful for game designers. First, establish a base camp. And now, here's the hard part: start walking away from the base camp. That's what it's for. It's the thing that you walk away from. Kentucky Route Zero begins with a sunset, and most of the game takes place across one long underground night. Adventure games, too, have lived through a sunset and appeared to slip underground for a long time. Like Donald, many of us could be accused of huddling around our bonfires of dead computers, thinking only about the past, not the future. But the underground is a potent metaphor. It can be a place to escape the light, but also a place to grow and thrive outside it. It can be where things go to die, but also the place they emerge from reborn. At the end of 3 decades of commercial stagnation, adventure games occupy a strange place in gaming's cultural landscape, at once both a distant memory of a long-forgotten form and a vibrant, influential source of threads still active in mainstream design. Sam Barlow, designer of Her Story, has observed that the continuing narrative of the adventure game's demise hides a deeper truth about its role in gaming culture. He says, "I think part of it comes from a certain self-consciousness and a certain desire for the medium to hurry up and grow up. Adventure games often feel like an awkward middle ground between the proper narrative games we aspire to and our cruder earlier attempts." Adventure games are indeed, and always have been, awkward. They provide a stage to try out being heroes weirder than those in the mainstream, but maybe also with more truth inside them. They get us lost and ask us to find our own way out again, coming to a new understanding of the world the way we think about it or ourselves. Rather than a focus on mastery of skill and separating winners from losers, they can center the uncertain but tantalizing sensation of encountering the unfamiliar. Near Kentucky Route Zero's conclusion at the end of Act 4, the enigmatic character Weaver Marquez offers not a puzzle but a mystery in the closed captioning of a distorted pirate television signal. "Go underground as deep as you can go. The air is cool and the earth is damp, and when you close your eyes you are surrounded by the dead. Remember where that is? You'll find your way from there. I think this place is what you're looking for." I'm Aaron A. Reed. Thank you for watching. Thanks to the organizers and volunteers of Neuroscope for having me and for your efforts to bring this conference back this year. And I hope you enjoyed this talk.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say before we jump into questions, it feels weird on one level to be talking about games right now with everything going on. But I think Kentucky Route Zero is a game about corrupt institutions and dehumanizing systems of control. And it's a good moment to think about turning its ideas into actions. So I just wanted to point people to the fact that the game's creators have urged folks who can do so to contribute to the Louisville Community Bail Fund in Kentucky. And there's also an Act Blue racism and police brutality fund that splits donations between a number of deserving charities. And I'll put both of those links in the Discord Q&A channel. But yeah, happy to answer questions if folks have any.
Epic asking, they're thinking really hard because of what you said about Act 5, both as a maze and as queerly entangled space. Any thoughts about what happens once you finally emerge from underground?
Yeah, and I think Act 5 is very much concerned with that question, right? Like what happens, how do you know where your journey ends? How do you know when you've, achieved what you wanted set out? Is there ever an ending, or is it always just, a new beginning? So a lot of the ideas in the talk, I came up with about a year ago before Act 5 came out, and it was interesting playing it to see what stuff kind of resonated with those sort of theories and interpretations I had at that time and what stuff challenged it. I think a lot of people felt like Act 5 didn't give them the kind of answers they were hoping to get. And I think if you were kind of expecting that Act 5 was going to tie everything up in a nice tidy bow, you may have, missed some of the things that were happening along the way. Like I kind of never expected that it would have that kind of satisfactory conclusion. But I thought it was interesting in the way, they sort of, it had a very kind of unfocused, but not in a negative way, in a like soft focus way, right? Like so for most, I think maybe all of Act 5, you're controlling a cat that's running around this vignette of everyone trying to sort of figure out what's happening in the aftermath of this flood that's destroyed everything. So you're not controlling any of the characters you've controlled through the whole game. And while the earlier acts often, will have things that are sort of more zoomed in and closer to the characters, all of Act 5 stays very zoomed out. You're seeing the whole community, you're seeing the whole tableau. Um, and it was interesting to me how much of it was about sort of people struggling to define their relationship to a community, right? Like, is this the place that I'm meant to stay? Should I move on and hope for something better? What's the value of staying here and rebuilding, even if maybe this isn't the perfect spot to do that in? Um, so I think for me that connects, I think, to some of the stuff about, um, that Bo Ruberg talks about with queer games and queer lives, in that, um, you know, you don't have, uh, uh, found families. There's always that sense of like, well, I wasn't born into this. I chose to opt into this group of people or this community of activists or whatever it is, right? And is this the right one for me? Should I stay here and make this better, or should I strike out on my own? So yeah, I think some of those themes, did sort of keep resonating with me through Act 5. Hopefully that answers the original question.
Max Kreminsky asking, this may be too specific, any thoughts about how the expansive, sprawling, can't find all the facets of the story aspect of KRZ relates to James Ryan's aesthetics of the vast?
Oh, interesting. Um, yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think it definitely wants to feel like a game that is spilling out of its box. Like I kind of said that earlier on in the talk, right? Like all of the interstitial acts, I think, are sort of helping to work to build the sense of the game, you know, is bigger than, it is on the outside, right? Like there are all of these characters who get introduced and forgotten about for a couple acts and then show up again in like a surprising context later on. Um, I can't. I need to refresh my memory about James' conception of the vast specifically. But I think, uh, there's definitely, it doesn't use any kind of, generative story tech, or sort of, the kind of stuff that happens in research and that a lot of, talks at this conference have been about. But I think it sort of wants to be connected to that world, and it's sort of touching it on an aesthetic level, if not a technical level, as much. Um, so yeah, there's you could do a whole reading on that angle, I'm sure.
There are a lot of theory questions coming up that are outside my scope. Dan Cox asking, like the connection with Ruberg's work, how important do you think the metaphor of the cave and the confusion of a cave is in bringing hope after a life underground for queer readers and developers?
Yeah, I as you probably gather from the talk, I just really love that as a central metaphor because it has so many layers to it. And I think one of the things the game sort of celebrates is the value of sort of disappearing for a while, right? Of finding a little den that you can snuggle down into and be immune to what's going on outside. And when you decide you're ready to emerge from that, you might have been able to become something that you couldn't have if you stayed out in the sun in the spotlight the whole time. um, I think there's layers to. I mean, I wrote a thing about one of my own projects that's on Underground a while ago, where I talked about how it's really interesting that caves have been commonly used as a metaphor both for birth, right, with comparisons to like crawling through a cave passage is like a birth canal, but also to death, right, with caves being like the realm of the underworld and where things go to die, right? So I think it's just this very charged concept that we have, and I personally have been a caver a good chunk of my life, and that's a hobby of mine I really love indulging in. And there's just I think our brains are wired to find that just an incredibly scary, but also spiritual, but also you know interesting space on so many different levels.
Chris asking, how do you think the experience of KR0 is inherently different for people who started 7 years ago versus people like me, as it happens, who played it, got it at the end, and played it straight through?
Yeah, I can't even imagine what it would have been like to just binge the whole game at once, because my personal experience of it was so, contingent on these like long, sometimes multiple year long waits between, new acts. Uh, yeah, I mean, for me, so much of it was like the imagining of where the story might go and what this all might be building to. So, huge parts of the game for me sort of lived in my head. Um, yeah, I think what I've wanted to do and I haven't had a chance to do yet since Act 5 came out is do that, like spend a week where, it's like Monday night I do Act 4, Tuesday night I do or Act 1, excuse me, Tuesday I do Act 2, right, and just sort of try to replay the whole thing again in quick succession and just see if it strikes me any differently. I do remember when I replayed it all, not quite that quickly, but over the course of 3 or 4 weeks maybe, the first 4 acts when I was writing the original book chapter. And a lot of connections jumped out to me that I never picked up originally, because there were so many references to characters and stuff that were, it had been like 2 years or 3 years since I last heard that character's name, and I totally forgotten who they were. So when I replayed it, I sort of kept the index of character references and was amazed by how many casual characters keep reoccurring in different roles. Or you realize that, like, oh, Marianne, the receptionist in Act 2, is actually one of the people who was involved in the Xanadu project in Act 3, right? Like there are all of these little connections like that I think playing it as one, continuous game, it's a lot easier to draw those parallels and make those connections. I don't think that necessarily makes the experience better, because it has such a dreamlike quality anyway that if you're not catching any of that stuff, it just makes it seem like, oh, okay, some random woman named Marianne has appeared. That's cool. But it's sort of a more, I think, you get a little more of the long-term plans I think they have for the whole structure when you play it all at once. So.
Question from Primaterial Cast. When you talk about dichotomies of smart versus dumb, lead versus noob, live versus die, do you have any other ideas of what games can aspire to, I guess, besides dichotomy? Is it just abandoning them as with walking sims, or are there more nuanced structures?
Yeah, so I've just always been really interested in challenging those kinds of, games have to offer you choices between left and right. So I'm really interested in stuff that can feel analog. Just one, I guess, example from my own work is I have a game where you're called 18 Cadence, where you're taking pieces of a story and dragging them kind of onto a workbench. And one of the things I added to that felt really important was you can sort of position them arbitrarily on the screen, but it also sort of modifies the angle of it based on where you clicked your mouse cursor, and sort of, pulls up the corner if you dragged it from the right side. And to me, that had no bearing on the mechanics, right? It didn't seem important on that level, but it felt very conceptually important, because it felt like even if someone had picked those same words and dragged them to those same spots on the screen, their story is going to be very slightly different than yours, because the little fragments aren't quite aligned the same way, right? It feels more like your own creation. And I think that's the thing that you can do as a designer, is to push back from like, well, in this game, are you going to be good or evil? And instead be like, well, okay, maybe instead of that, what are like a bunch of different ways you could perform aspects of being good or being evil? And your character is sort of the sum of all those actions, not a single number, right? So I think almost any time in a game, maybe almost any time is going a bit far, but anytime you can, right? If you can think about, well, is there an alternative to kind of flattening the player's participation to either 0 or 1, right? Is there interesting middle ground in there, and especially an aggregate that you can build up, so that the player feels like they've contributed something that is unique to them. That's one of the sweet spots that in my own games I always am trying to shoot for.
Can you say more about your upcoming book, upcoming in the paperback edition, and its use as a textbook?
Yeah, I'm really proud of the book. So John and Anastasia and I wrote that over the course of the last 2 years. The project of the book is to look at adventure games, both kind of historically, and then there's sort of many modern descendants, through the lens of the outsider is kind of an overall metaphor. So we kind of talk about how, the first generation of computer games was sort of made by outsiders who then, suddenly found themselves become the mainstream. And that's kind of also the same time around, the early 90s when adventure games kind of started getting pushed out in favor of, more action focused games and other kinds of models. And then there's all these different waves of outsiders who have come in and left their mark on that form in the years since. So there's, like the outsiders who were, maybe like blind or disabled, who couldn't play those action games and wanted, something that, was accessible to them. There's the waves of, hacker outsiders who really missed the Infocom games and kind of rebuilt a tool set to keep making and playing those games for themselves. There's, sort of queer and indie outsiders in the last decade who have kind of reclaimed a lot of the tropes of adventure games. I think it's really noteworthy that a lot of the really culturally significant games of the last 10 years have kind of had direct adventure references to adventure games. So like Gamergate was kicked off by Depression Quest, whose title, right, is like calling back to those kind of games. We have a whole generation of designers who grew up playing those games, and even though they're no longer the mainstream games, they've obviously been hugely influential. So I think what we're trying to do in the book is say that, people aren't really talking about this as a genre very much, but all of these things, from walking simulators to escape rooms to visual novels and dating sims, all of these have either direct or implicit connections to adventure games. And what does it mean to sort of talk about all of them as a sort of body of work that descends from this particular form that was dominant in the 80s. So that's kind of the overall project, and this talk is sort of taken from the last chapter that kind of uses KRZ as a way to sort of touch on a bunch of the themes that exists in the book as a whole. So I'm proud of it, and I'm looking forward to the paperback release so that more people can get their hands on it.